think I'm gonna be sad. I think it's today. Yeah. The girl that's driving me mad is going away. She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride, but she don't care.
Hi, and welcome to the Plastic EP Show. We're here today with so many wonderful people to celebrate one person in particular. And we've got with us today Fred VELEZ, collector and big fan of the Monkees and the Beatles. We've got Daniel COSTON, an extremely good journalist. We have NATALIE Palumbo, who's worked with film and wonderful work with animation. And film is just so pleasant to see. Lots of stuff done for McCartney. And we have another special guest. We have Ivor Davis here, a journalist extraordinaire, accompanying the Beatles and winner of a new award, an Ippy Award, just announced yesterday for his most recent book, called The Devil in My Friend, a true crime book. And, of course, our guest of honor today, in addition to Plastic EP, whose show it is, we have Bruce Spizer, whose recent birthday and whose newest book are just out, the completion of his current and ongoing, I think, volume 9, perhaps, of his Beatles on Record series. We have with us today Bruce Spizer.
Bruce, fill everyone in on all the books that you have now and where we're at now and where they can get your fantastic books.
Wow. I have actually now 17 books, and it started about 27 years ago where I did a book called The Beatles Records on VJ, which was going to be a little footnote in Beatles history on a gospel R&B label that was the first record company in the United States to put out a couple of Beatle records. And the book came out and people said, you have to do a book on their Capitol records. So I did, one for albums, one for singles. And then, okay, well, you got to do stuff on Apple. So I did that. And then Apple Solo. I took a slight detour when it was the 40th anniversary of the Beatles' arrival in America and did what is my favorite book I've ever done called The Beatles Are Coming, The Birth of Beatlemania in America, which told this convoluted story of how Beatlemania occurred. And it was a lot of fun doing it. And in doing it, I said I got to meet 3 of my childhood, heroes. And people were like, oh, wow, Paul and Ringo. I said, no. Walter Cronkite, Mike Wallace, and Edward Newman. And these were esteemed members of the U.S. press. And it was important because the press played an important part of the story of getting Beatlemania jump-started in America. And then I thought, okay, well, I need to wrap things up on these record company things. So I did a book called The Beatles' Swan Song, She Loves You and Other Records, which was a pun because that was my swan song. And after 8 books, I wasn't going to write any more books on the Beatles. And that worked until a guy named Frank Daniels put a gun to my head and said, you and I need to do a book on the Parlophone records. So we did, called Beatles for Sale on Parlophone Records. And then I thought, okay, I've written about all of the record labels. I am done. Thank you very much. And then we got to 2017. And I realized, gee, this is the 50th anniversary of Sgt. Pepper. And I should do a really good article for some magazine. And I did this really good article. And then I thought, I envision it being a company with color images. So that's going to rule out Beatle Fan. And what other Beatle magazines are there still? Uh-oh. And I thought, well, maybe I could put out my own magazine. No, I can't put out my own magazine, but I can put out a book. And so I thought the only way I can get the book in time would be if I got literally a little help from my friends. So I got the idea that I would contact Al Sussman and Bill King of Beatle Fan magazine and see if they could contribute to the book. Piers Hemmingson to give the Canadian slant, and a buddy of mine, Frank Daniels, to see what he could come up with. And then I thought, why don't I just hear from ordinary, everyday people? And for this book, we'll have what we call fan recollections. and just let people write in and say what Pepper meant to them. And I began to notice a very interesting trend that people had bonds with their fathers or mothers over Sergeant Pepper, which I didn't see coming, and that was kind of cool. And then I got one from a guy who was a member of this group called the Royal Guardsmen, who did the Snoopy records. And his story was, of course, you do Christmas songs in the summertime, and he was driving to the studio to do Snoopy's Christmas. And Sergeant Pepper came on the radio, and he had to pull to the side of the road and listen to it. But can you imagine going into the studio to record Snoopy's Christmas after listening to A Day in the Life? I mean, I can't imagine that. But I realized, musicians are big Beatle fans. And I thought, gee, maybe I can get some more help from my friends. And of course, my buddy and Natalie's buddy and several people's buddy, Tom Frangione, I knew Tom knew Pat Denizio of the Smithereens. And so Pat was able to write something. And then I said, Tom, you're doing stuff with Sirius XM. And what about Billy Joel? And Tom was like, yeah, that'd be cool. And so through a few people at Sirius XM and Billy Joel's manager, I got Billy Joel's Sergeant Pepper story, which was really cool. And he had said, no one's ever asked me that before. And it was a great story. And so my book came out. And when the book came out, people were like, well, Bruce, of course, you have to do a White Album book because that is your favorite album. So, okay, I did a White Album book. And then people were like, well, you got to do Abbey Road. And at that point in time, I'm like, I see a series. And so then, of course, it was kind of fun because the Abbey Road book I called The Beatles Get Back to Abbey Road, which was a bit of a pun because the Beatles literally were getting back to Abbey Road Studios to do that album after having misadventures elsewhere. And then I thought, okay, we have to do the Let It Be book. And I remembered how the Let It Be project kept being postponed. And I thought, well, I'll just call that book The Beatles Finally Let It Be. In the day that I signed my contract with the printer to do that book, I got word from EMI, or not no longer EMI, it was Universal Music Group, that because of COVID, they were delaying their box set on Let It Be. And I thought, I'm going to go ahead and proceed with the book anyway. And I put that book out, and people kind of liked that because they were like, gee, something came out during COVID. And the nice thing about it was because I wasn't getting my books printed in China, I was able to actually have product when most people's books in the publishing industry were stranded at the port of Long Beach or whatever. And then, of course, I thought, well, I need to go backwards through the Sea of Time and do a book on Yellow Submarine, a Magical Mystery Tour. And I did that book, and then it was like, okay, what do I do next? And I thought, how about Rubber Soul and Revolver? Because if I do that, my next book, I can go all the way back and have my Please Please Me with the Beatles book come out on the 60th anniversary of those records. And of course, that was followed by book number 8 in the series, The Beatles, A Hard Day's Night, and more. And it covered a lot more than just A Hard Day's Night. And then the last one, number nine, would be called Beatles for Sale to Help. And that one officially is coming out on August 12th. However, it is already available through my website, Beatle.net, and we've already sent out pre-orders. And I remember fairly recently signing a book to Natalie, and it's up to please Mr. Postman to get it to her quickly.
You got the book there? You show everybody?
That's right there, yeah.
That's the one.
And it was a lot of fun and work doing these books. But, when you're working with a great group of people, it makes it so much easier. All the books have fan recollections. And this is something I'm particularly proud of because I know this is not easy to do. And that is, I had the complete team for all 9 books in the series. And that was that Piers Hemingson wrote about Canada in every book. Al Sussman wrote about what was going on in the world and news and music. Frank Daniels contributed a fun off-kilter chapter on the Beatles and James Bond, which was a lot of fun. And then Bill King did his fan notes. And also, he, for the last 2 books, Hard Day's Night and this Help book, gave me his interview with Walter Shenson to add to it, the producer of those films. So, keeping the gang together for 9 books And by the way, every book I've done, I've had the same wonderful graphic designer, Diana Thornton. And, I can tell you what a pleasure it's been working with her. The same pleasure that Tom Frangione and others feel working with Natalie on all those projects. Because when you have a talented graphic designer, it really makes the project. And I've just been blessed with assembling a good team and keeping them all together.
Now, Ivor, the floor's yours.
Does anybody know what this weekend anniversary is? I'm going to give you a clue. John met Paul
At the
in
fete. Wooden
right
fete.
when John was doing his skiffle band stuff.
Yeah, wooden fete. The church.
The church, Walston, in Walston, right?
Yeah, that's it.
And I suddenly saw that, I heard about it, and I thought, wow, isn't that amazing? This weekend, so many years ago, and they must have gone on quite well because they did well after that, I believe. Anyway, so my Beatle book, the trouble is, I must admit that I did a Beatle book, a new Beatle book with a lot of new stuff and a lot of new pictures, which came out last year. And I also did a murder book which came out 3 months later. Do not do that. Bruce, you are prolific, but do not do that. If you're going to bring a book out, bring it out on music, not murder and then music, because sometimes I show up, I don't know wherever it was, and I'm not sure what I'm talking about. And fortunately, the audience prompts me and says, who are these? What's this murder story about? And I said, no, I'm supposed to be talking about the Beatles. Okay, so my new Beatle book, my not so new Beatle book, was came out last year. It was the 60th anniversary of my travels with the Beatles. And I've already blethered this on to plastic, and everybody else knows me. Where is my book? Here it is. The Beatles and Me on Tour, 60th anniversary edition. We're coming up to the 61st anniversary edition of me traveling with the Beatles, which was an incredible trip. But the funny thing is, I must tell you this, it took me a long time to chronicle my amazing travels with the Beatles, because I was a journalist and I was a foreign correspondent. And a day after I came back from the Beatle trip, my office called me in London and said, forget the Beatles, get on to the Warren Commission report about the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Now, of John Kennedy, sorry. So, I mean, I go back a long time, a long, long time. I'm probably almost, even though Bruce has his father time beard on, I am probably the oldest among you lot. So excuse me for rambling on, but I'm going to throw the ball back to you. I've said enough. Thank you.
And Ivor, I understand your situation because I give presentations, as you know, at the Festival Beatle Fans and some
Yeah.
little event in Charlotte and all these other great places. And I also give talks as an attorney.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yes, of
so,
course.
yeah, and that can be interesting, where I have to remember, okay, am I talking about ethics or professionalism or qualified retirement plans or estate planning, or am I going to have fun and talk about the Beatles? And the other fun thing is, one time I was at a Beatles convention in Chicago the same weekend as Comic Con. So I went over to Comic Con and I got a special T-shirt there, and I walked up on stage and I started talking and I said, it's really exciting to be here today. And, the origins right now of the Fantastic Four began, and I started talking about the Fantastic Four. And people in the audience were looking like, what's going on with Bruce? Does he know? If I said, well, isn't this Comic Con? And they're like, no, you're at the Beatle Fest. I said, okay. Well, rather than talking about the Fantastic Four, I'll talk about the Fab Four.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I'm going to ask you one question, Bruce, because you've written so many books. You're so knowledgeable. Um, did you ever get into the depth of the legal battles for the Beatles songs with Michael Jackson and all that rigmarole?
A little bit. I never wrote about it, and people have said, and I can't tell you how many people have said, Bruce, you need to do a book on the Beatles lawsuits. You would be the perfect person to do it. You're an attorney. And I said, yes, let me do a book that will anger Paul, Ringo, Yoko, Olivia, Capitol Records, Universal Music Group. Oh, yeah, that's a great idea. Sign me up. And then they said, well, Bruce, you could do the book under an assumed name. And I'm like, yeah, like AI wouldn't catch me. Not happening.
Good. That's a great answer. And thank you. And I'll throw the ball back to whoever Plastic wants to throw the ball to next.
For Bruce, I would just say that you've always been the highlight of the fest for me as an author, almost in residence. And beginning in the 90s and before the era of the internet and everything, you were one of the only sources on the Beatles on record that I'd ever heard or read. And it was just a pleasure hearing it, especially when you covered the American albums. Because once the 80s had come and gone and the CDs came out, everybody had forgotten that the running list and order. It's not like we had a choice in the US of which version of the albums to listen to.
Yeah.
Rarities, not rarities, but it was rare to find British imports at an affordable price. And they weren't allowed to play them on the radio. So if there were unreleased tracks or anything, we didn't get to hear them. So it was nice to be able to see a discussion on the albums as I listened to them as I grew up. Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
love
And the thing I wanted to do in the books, and when I did the Capitol books, was really point out that Capitol had been unfairly maligned. People would go, Capitol butchered the Beatles. And I'd say, no. You know, I have an MBA in finance and marketing. Capitol marketed the Beatles. And at the time, every country was releasing music for their own market. We were not in a global community in the 60s. And this was very common. It wasn't just Capitol that did it. It wasn't just for the Beatles. The Rolling Stones manager even put out different Rolling Stone albums in the UK and the US, different singles in the UK and US, because he knew the markets were different. For example, in the UK, Little Red Rooster was a #1 song for the Stones, but in the US, it probably would have made top 20. And so these were different markets, and Capitol was marketing the Beatles for the United States of America. And if you think about it, if you were going to put out an album to introduce this British group to America, you couldn't do any better than Meet the Beatles. And the reason the records were different was two reasons. One, UK albums typically had 14 tracks. In the US, they had 12 or 11. The reason that they had less was in the US, we paid mechanical licenses on a per song basis, whereas in the UK, it was on a per record basis. So on an album, whether there were 12 tracks, 14 tracks, or 20 tracks, in the UK, the royalty rate was the same, whereas in the US, it was an extra 2 cents per song. Now, I know you're thinking, come on, Bruce. That means if Capitol had 11 tracks rather than 14, they only saved 6 cents per album. Multiply that by $1 million in sales, and now you're at 60,000 adjusted for inflation, and now you're at $300,000 or $400,000. So yeah, it was a big deal back then. That was part of it, but also Capitol had a philosophy. How many copies do you think before the Beatles a teen album would sell, like the Beach Boys? Anyone want to give a guess?
100,000.
250,000 would be the maximum.
Wow.
Well, Capitol's philosophy was we got to sell albums. How about hit singles make hit albums? And so we're going to put I Want to Hold Your Hand on Meet the Beatles. Well, Meet the Beatles, about 2.5 months after its release date, had sold 3.6 million copies. So you get the idea. Did it work? Yes, it worked fabulously well. And then when Capitol put out their next album, which had leftover tracks that weren't on Meet the Beatles, it was a little thing called the Beatles' second album. And that was an incredible album. And even people that hate what Capitol did will say, you know, the Beatles' second album is a great rock and roll album. It has to be. Please, Mr. Postman, she loves you. You know, I mean, come on. What album wouldn't be? Roll Over Beethoven? I mean, come on. And so what Capitol did made sense for the United States. And they did a really good job of marketing the Beatles.
Right, I got 2 comments there if I can, right? Now, with the Beatles coming out with their albums and so forth, I just want to compare it to the Monkees because Don Kirshner put out more of the Monkees without telling the Monkees anything. And you got to understand, that was a business decision. It was coming near Christmas and he wanted to get the market while it was white hot. So got all these monkey songs from the TV show, put out what the people wanted, and that became the highest selling album on the charts and in sales. And the monkeys hated that album, but he made the right product for the teeny boppers at the right time. So I know exactly what you're talking about, Bruce, because it's all relevant.
Bruce, good to see you again, and happy
Yes,
belated
indeed.
birthday, by the way. So,
Well, thank you. In case you all are wondering, I got to be honest, I turned 70 years old, and it's
Oh,
great. I don't feel a day older than 69, so it's working out great.
I wouldn't have
And I
guessed that.
actually, yeah,
Congratulations.
thank you. And I actually found out that I was in better shape than I thought because I took a trip to going to a wedding in Italy, and then I stopped off in London to meet with Universal Music Group. But while I was in Italy, I climbed two bell towers, which had each of them had over 400 steps. And I was able to do that. And I thought, well, I'm in better shape than I thought. And then when my book arrived in New Orleans, in boxes of 10, they weigh 30 pounds. And with the assistance of someone else, I moved 150 boxes off a pallet onto a dolly several times and then up to the shelves, which is the equivalent of moving 300 books. Not bad for a 70-year-old, but what I will tell you, when you're moving 30-pound boxes of books, after a while they weigh 40 pounds and eventually they weigh 50 pounds. Trust me on that one.
several of your books have been in my car, so I totally understand that. So,
That's right.
yes.
He knows how heavy those boxes are.
Yeah, so my question, we were mentioning Capital. For months, Capital, or at least some folks at Capital are going, no, this Beatles thing won't work in America. These British acts don't do well in the US. And then in a period of weeks, it goes 180. In your research, did you find that there was a timeline, a window, or even a day where the penny dropped for Capital? They went, oh, okay, this is really happening.
They had a guy in charge of foreign artist and repertoire, Dave Dexter. And Dexter did put out British records, and they sold very poorly. Part of that was what he was putting out. But, you know, the only big hit that Dexter put out that was a million seller from the UK was Laurie London's He's Got the Whole World in His Hand. So you've got a 12-year-old boy gospel singing song, and that's the big seller, the big payoff. But he didn't like rock and roll, for one thing, and he didn't like harmonica on pop records. That was a blues instrument and had no business on pop. So you have to understand when he turned down Love Me Do, that was no big deal because EMI did not believe in Love Me Do. It did get to 17. When he turned down Please Please Me, George Martin was pretty upset about it and basically, told EMI, get the bloody record out in the States. And so Capitol turned them down and they ended up on VJ. And the reason they ended up on VJ Records, a gospel R&B label out of Chicago, black owned, was because VJ had the same lawyer as EMI in America, a company called Trans Global, guy named Paul Marshall. And he had gotten an earlier record that Capitol had turned down called I Remember You by Frank Ifield. How many people remember I Remember You? Well,
He was Australian.
Yes, he was originally Australian. He moved to the UK. You are absolutely right. And the record got to number 5 on the charts, which was pretty incredible. And so at that point in time, Paul Marshall, after nobody wanted the Beatles, thought maybe VJ can do something with them. And VJ put out Please Please Me. It sold under 5,000 copies, got airplay in a couple of markets, top 40 in those markets. And then they put out From Me to You. A lot of times George Martin says Capitol turned down From Me to You. Not true. VJ had a right of first refusal on their contract that lasted or would have lasted 5 years had things gone differently. So From Me to You comes out on VJ, but it runs into a Del Shannon cover version, which doesn't help matters. And then VJ, and you can't make this stuff up, has serious financial difficulties because of their president, Ewart Abner, having a gambling problem and embezzling a couple of $100,000 of VJ money to pay off personal gambling debts. So they're unable to pay royalties. For that reason, Paul Marshall, the attorney with EMI's Trans Global, sends him a letter and says, you no longer can put out records by the Beatles or Frank Ifield. By the way, Beatles was spelled with 2 T's in that telegram. So I guess it would have been the Beatles. And so they end up, Capitol turns down She Loves You, and Dexter has a choice because Ifield is also available, and he can put out Frank Ifield and the Beatles or one of them. And Dexter listens to both the songs, and oddly enough, he goes with I'm Confessing by Frank Ifield rather than She Loves You by the Beatles, particularly perplexing because what instrument is in I'm Confessing? Harmonica. So very strange. And, and She Loves You bombs. It sells probably under 1,000 units upon its initial release. And, all of a sudden, EMI is doing really well with the Beatles, and Brian is very frustrated with Capitol. And Brian calls up, and this is what you do when you're frustrated with a company. You try to get to the top of the company. And he called Alan Livingston, and he was the president of Capitol. And basically he said, I'm the personal manager of the Beatles. Why won't you play our records and put them out? And Alan said, well, quite frankly, I've never listened to them. And Brian said, well, why don't you listen to them and you make the call? And so he called on the intercom Dexter at the Capitol Tower and said, bring me up a couple of records of the Beatles. And Dexter said, Alan, they're nothing. They're a bunch of long-haired kids. Nonetheless, Livingston listened to it, and he heard something there and decided they would put out the Beatles. So he calls up Brian and says, we'll put out, your new single. And Brian runs a bluff and he says, we're not going to let you put out our single. Like Brian has a choice of stopping him because they have a right of first refusal, unless you agree to spend $50,000 promoting the record, which was unheard of in those days. How did you promote records in those days? You took out an ad in trade magazines like Billboard and Cashbox. The idea was that if record stores and record distributors and radio stations were aware of your record, radio stations would play it, distributors would have it, and record stores would carry it, and you've done your work. Nobody thought about something that Capitol thought about doing. How about if we market to kids that are going to be the ones purchasing it? And they launched the Beatles campaign. Earlier, I mentioned I concentrated in marketing while I was in graduate business school, and Capitol did an incredible job with their Beatles campaign. And it really is the first time that a record company took an active approach in marketing their product to the consumer directly. Very important. All these crazy stories are in my book, The Beatles Are Coming, which is, as I've said, my favorite book out of the books I've done. One of the reasons it's my favorite is I got to interview those heroes of mine and also had the honor of having Walter Cronkite write the foreword to the book, which to me really meant a lot to me. And when that book came out, my parents were like, wow, you got Walter Cronkite to do the foreword. And I was at a Beatles convention when the book came out, and a guy from, I think it was Random House, came up to me and boy, Bruce, that's quite a coup. How much did you pay Mr. Cronkite? I said, pay? He says, yeah. People like that get a lot of money to write a foreword. I said, I just asked. So
You have such incredible knowledge of that, of the music and the records and the record companies. I remember before she died, Louise Harrison, she probably wrote about it as well, told me that after the Ed Sullivan show, or maybe it was the time of the Ed Sullivan show, Brian called Louise Harrison, George's sister, and said, can you take these records around to local DJs and see if they will play them? Did you ever hear that story, Bruce?
yeah, it was before the Sullivan show, and it was after VJ put out From Me to You. And Lou was trying to get From Me to You on the radio, and there actually is some correspondence. And in the digital edition, when I redid the VJ book, I have some of that correspondence where in what one of the program directors told her was, well, we've already started playing the Del Shannon version of From Me to You, and it's kind of late for us to switch, but they do sound good, and perhaps their next record will really be big. Well, their next record was She Loves You, so I guess later on it was really big. But Lou did try to promote the Beatles. But, look, I mean, hi, my brother's in a band from England. Will you please play the records?
Yeah.
She was really up against it, and God bless her for trying, but it would have been very difficult to get those records on the radio.
Hi, how you doing, sir? We met several years ago, and I was at the book signing of this book, the
Oh, great.
the Beatles are coming, and you were nice enough to let me find it, to sign it for me right
Oh,
there,
yes.
and
Look
I
at
appreciate it very
that.
much. And I really enjoyed this book. I love the pictures, I love the stories and everything. And that's the most recent one I've got, the Abbey Road one,
Yeah.
which you also, where is it? There it is. You also signed for me, which is
Yeah.
great. And I also have of your books, the Swan Song book,
Oh, yeah.
which is, and you sent me the one with the extras, all the little biddies,
Oh,
Look
yeah.
at that.
all the extra little thingies that came with the book. And
Oh,
let
the
me find
insert.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you signed it for me also, and I really
Yeah.
appreciate that. Um, things I like, and I've got your other books, but I have the digital versions because as much
Uh-huh.
as I love, as much as I'm sure myself and a lot of other people love physical books, and we do love them, it's just easier to read a digital book, you know.
Yeah, and that's a good point you raise. The Beatles album series, all of those are available in digital through the website in a PDF format, and they look great on a Kindle or great on a really on an iPad. They really look good, and you can also view them on the computer as well. And what we did, all the album series books are available that way, and then the VJ book and the two Capitol books, and those books are sold out, and they go a couple of $100 in the secondary market each. And for those books, we did a revised and expanded editions of those, so they have newly discovered information because I did those books like over 20 years ago, and of course, and since then, a lot of new information has come to my attention. And the website's very easy to remember. It's just Beatle, Beatle .net, N-E-T. No S in Beatles, no Beatle.com, Beatle.net. And also, and you saw those books at Fred show where the books are signed. Anyone ordering a book from my website, I automatically sign and date the book. And people can also request personalizations. And we're happy to help out people that way because look, I cannot compete with certain companies that I won't name. I don't even try to. I can't compete with them price wise because while they can operate on a small margin because of volume, I can't. And I can't give people free shipping. But the way I do it is I sign the books and I pack them really well. So when they arrive, they won't have dented corners. And if you do, out of the 500 or so books we sent out on the new book, two people called me up that had dented corners. We went ahead and sent them new books, no questions asked. Because we get so few that are damaged because of the way we pack them. And that's what we try to do because I can't do the books without people supporting us and buying our product. And they are a labor of love, but they're also very expensive to print. They're full color throughout and they're hardcover, and the printing costs are not cheap by any means. And for the album series, I've been doing them all in initially Canada, and then I switched to the US. And although it's much cheaper to print overseas, I'd rather give the business here. Plus, in these crazy times we're in, I like the certainty of knowing they're going to be printed somewhere and I'll be able to get them into the United States without tariffs, shipping costs, and other unexpected things happening. So, they're printed in the good old USA now.
Okay. I want to ask you about the other books, the Apple books. Are those going to become available as digital copies?
Yeah, I think they will. I'm taking a little bit of a break right now after doing 9 books in 9 years. But I had started the Apple book in the digital format and was probably about 80% done. And then I did the Sergeant Pepper book and took that little, 9 book detour. So I would imagine sometime, they will be available in some digital format. I just, right now, I need a break. Although, I've been working on my presentations there's in New Orleans, where I live, on the 12th of July, there's a Beatle concert, and I'm going to give a presentation on help for that. And I'll do a few things in New Orleans. And at the Fest for Beatle fans in Chicago, a presentation on help. I'm working on that presentation now, and I've gotten some help on that as I have for several of my presentations, if you see these wonderful videos and you're wondering, gee, Bruce must really be good at editing videos. But a guy named Steve Shorten is really good. And Steve's been helping me out with those over the years. And shout out to Steve for all of his help. So once again, I've been able to work with really good people, and that makes it a lot easier to tell the story when you have people help you tell that story.
Now I have your other books as digital copies, and I really enjoy going through them there because there's not just reading them by themselves, but just looking at the photos are amazing.
Yeah, that's the nice thing on the PDF format. You get those images, and we have a few books in Kindle format, and you just lose the layouts and the it's a different reading experience. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I prefer getting it directly from you and get the
Well, thank you.
PDF. It looks so much better.
And the other thing we do in this is that we've started doing some supplements with the books. In the digital editions, they have the supplements. If you buy the hardcover, you can download the supplement for free. If you don't buy the hardcover or any cover, you can download it for free on the website. And in the help book, the supplement, and it has some really cool stuff in it. For example, Frank Daniels and I are both big comic book fans in addition to Beatle fans. And in help, what does Paul's music desk on his organ have? Anybody remember? Has a bunch of comic books on
Yeah,
it,
that's
right?
right. Yeah.
Yeah. And Frank and I were able to determine what the 9 comic books on Paul's music desk were. And I actually went on eBay and bought all 9 of them. And the neat thing about it was I remembered reading those 9 books when I was a kid and had them in my collection. So we have a little section on the Help Superman family comic books, little things like that. So they're fun things in the supplement that didn't necessarily belong in the book, but were cool, and we felt we needed to put it somewhere.
So I had the fortune of witnessing Bruce's seminars at the Fest for Beatle Fans. I worked there as a photographer, so I was running around getting pictures just all over the place. But I had the fortune to watch his seminars talking about the breakdown of different Beatles songs, why they had the impact they did. And I found myself staying and listening a little bit longer because I was just fascinated by the stories he was telling. And same thing right now. Like I'm sitting here riveted listening to you tell stories about why you wrote these books, about working with Walter Cronkite on the foreword, which is fascinating. I'd love to hear more about that. And it made me think, have you thought of the potential for producing audiobooks for any of these books? Because I think that people would be very interested to hear you speak from your perspective, and maybe other people that wrote for these books from their perspective as well. Piers Hemmingson from Canada and the like.
I think that's a great idea. If I wasn't practicing law for full time, I'd probably move to something like that. And that's the thing that people don't always realize is I do have a full-time job as an attorney doing estate planning and successions and litigation and all kind of other crazy stuff. So, and people say, "How do you do it?" The answer is very simple. I don't need a lot of sleep, and but it works out well. And the other interesting thing is that writing a book on the Beatles is really not any different than preparing a lawsuit. In that, in a lawsuit, we do what we call discovery, which means we interview people and we put a review of documents, and then we have to word it in a way that people can understand it, in a way that'll be entertaining and won't put a judge or jury to sleep. So when I'm doing a book, I'm doing discovery. I'm interviewing people, reviewing documents, and then I got to write it up in a way that's easy to understand and it's entertaining. So
I just want to
but yeah,
say, if you need to know about audio books, talk to Scott because he helped Jude with the audio books. How was that with Jude's audio books?
oh yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think they're great, and Jude's devoting 100% of her time to this incredible John Lennon book series. I mean, incredible series. And I don't have 100% of my life devoted to these Beatle books. So, but I think that's a good idea. And if I ever retire, and here's the problem about retirement. When I turned 65, one of my sisters called me up and she said, "Congratulations, our father retired from pediatrics at 65." And she said, "But before you get too excited, our grandfather retired from law at 92." So I'm somewhere between 65 and 92 for retirement.
Well, I mean, it's fascinating because, I mean, the fact that Bruce talks so eloquently about them with such immaculate detail, because I am about to hit in a few days 87. So I'm an old geezer. I'm the senior citizen among you crowd. And the question I have for Bruce is, it's not really a question about the incredible books you write and research you can do. I find I sometimes forget what's his name, Plastic's name. No, I don't. But who could forget Plastic? But you know what I mean. So can I ask you for some getting older advice to aged writers like me? And because I think we're all going to get older, aren't we, Bruce?
Yeah, I last time I checked, it used to be when I'm 64, and boy, that was 6 years ago.
Yeah. Sleep. How many hours sleep do you get by? Because there should be three of you to do what you do, and there's only one of you, I believe. So how do you manage? Sorry, I mean this is like medical report. Give me your medical situation. I mean, how do you manage it?
5 hours of sleep is all I need.
Five. Okay.
I just want to say, Ivor, it's my birthday next Wednesday, right? I'm not going to say my age, right? But I also want to say happy 4th of July to everyone out there because it's the 4th today. So tomorrow, which is Thursday, is going to be the 5th. That'll be your 4th of July. And when it's my birthday on the 9th of July, because we're in the same month, Ivor.
Yeah.
Right? It'll be a Thursday in the States, but it'll be a Wednesday here.
It's like the trick question that people ask, Canadians like Pearson, they'll say, "Does Canada have a 4th of July?" The answer is, of course, they have a 4th of July. It's not Independence Day, but they do have a 4th of July.
There you go.
Bruce, obviously you've researched the entire history of the Beatles. Was there any particular period of the Beatles that surprised you more than others? Obviously, you would think that, we've all heard the stories of the Beatles. There are some partial truth stories of the Beatles throughout the years, but more things, as you said, keep turning up. More things we did know. Is there any specific period in your research that seemed to surprise you more than others?
Well, I think when I was doing the very first book, the VJ book, that really surprised me because I had read, a bunch of books on the Beatles. And when I was reading it, I initially said, "Oh, yeah, well, it's in every book. It must be true." And then I began thinking like an attorney and said, that doesn't sound right. I don't know if that's true or not. Let me do some original research on it. And then people would say, and I'd ask people, and they go, "Oh, no, 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 that's in every book." And I thought, well, what if every book's wrong? Turned out every book was wrong. And I found that to be interesting, and you learn different things. For example, we hear certain things that are supposed to be true, and we find out aren't necessarily true. But we find out why they said what they did. For example, we all know Paul says we weren't going to America until we had a number one hit. And doesn't take long to realize that Brian Epstein booked the Beatles to go to America to be on the Ed Sullivan Show before Capitol Records even signed the Beatles. So is Paul lying? No. Listen to what Paul says in Anthology. We weren't going to go to America because we didn't want to be second fiddle on a tour of people like Frankie Avalon and Bobby V or whatever. So what Paul was really saying is we weren't going to tour America until we had a number one hit. And that's true. By the time they toured America in August, they had tons of number one hits. So I think it's interesting, when you see these stories and try to pick up. One other story that you hear all the time, Ed Sullivan seeing the Beatles, in London at the airport. Great story. However, I don't think it happened. And the reason I say that is I've talked to a few people that were on the Sullivan Show, and they've said, when the show was in season, Ed pretty much stuck to New York. And the other thing was Ed had a column that he came out with about twice a week in the New York papers called, I think it was Talk of the Town. And he would talk about what he and his wife were up to. And nowhere at that time frame does he say, hey, the wife and I were in London recently. So I think that was a story that was created by the PR department of CBS. And
I
that's
think
that.
you're absolutely right, Bruce, because that story has always been fishy. Ed
Yeah.
Sullivan says I was at London and there was a huge crowd there, and I thought it was for the Queen or the King of England, and it wasn't for the royalty, it was for the Beatles. I mean, so Ed suddenly the light came on in Ed's head. He said, "Well, if they're that big in England, we've got to bring them over." It's a wonderful story, but I think you're right. You're going to shoot it down in flames, and I agree with you, Bruce.
Yeah. And the guy he interviewed, a guy named Peter Prichard, Peter worked for Lou Grade in the UK, and he was also Ed Sullivan's European talent scout. And when Peter heard that Brian was going to New York, he called up Brian and said, while you're in New York, you need to meet with this guy, Ed Sullivan. You need to get the Beatles on the show,
Yeah,
and I can arrange it for you. And Brian said, no, no, I'd rather do it myself. And Brian had those initial meetings with Ed Sullivan. When I did the book, The Beatles Are Coming, I wanted to interview Bob Precht, who was the producer of The Sullivan Show. And I asked around, and I was told Bob Precht is not giving interviews anymore. End of story. And I was disappointed, but I did the best I could. So the book comes out, and about, I guess, 5 years after that, I run into a woman at a Beatles convention, and she says, I do a book fair for a school in Maryland. We'd love to have you be a speaker for it. I said, okay, great. I'd love to do it. And she says, oh, by the way, Bob Precht's my dad. So, yeah. And so,
No.
um, so about a year after I did the show, I get a phone call from Bob Precht, and he told me that he had read the book, really enjoyed it, and said basically, you nailed it. And to me, that was quite a compliment, getting it from somebody who truly was there for
yeah.
everything.
Why did Brian take Billy J. Kramer and not the boys with him when he went to New York? What's your feeling about that, if you have a feeling about that?
Well, for one thing, the Beatles were, booked pretty heavily at that time. And he also had visions of Billy J being, this great crooner as opposed to a rock and roller. And he kind of wanted to do that. And one of the funny stories was Brian's attorney, Walter Hofer, lined up a party for Billy J and Brian, and hardly anyone showed up
Yeah.
for the party. So one of those things that, it wasn't a big
You
success,
didn't
but
think that Brian was going to say, if Ed Sullivan said, "Well, I'm not crazy about your guys," then he was going to say, "Okay, go forward, Billy J. You're the kind of sleek crooner type, and not Sinatra, but you know what I mean." Do you think that
no.
ever went on, or was that a fake story?
I mean, I think he truly wanted Billy J to be that kind of entertainer. I don't think Billy J wanted to be that kind of entertainer. I think that was part of the problem there. And Billy J was, he's very intimidated by New York when I talked to him about it. And, but he did a local TV show. I think it's the Joe Franklin show and stuff, so
Oh,
there's just a lot of fun things so that you find out when you interview people. What you have to watch out for, though, is many people overstate their importance in the Beatles story. And you have to be careful of that and take some of those things with a grain of salt, like Nicky Byrne, who did the
Yeah.
marketing of Beatle products and
Oh
T-shirts and
yeah,
all. And he says, well, the only reason 3,000 people were there at the airport is we gave them free T-shirts and this and that. And as far as Capitol Records was concerned, you know, they weren't going to make a big deal of it. Nothing could be further from the truth. As part of my research, I came across memos that were written by Capitol Records that involved Capitol, CBS, and the Ed Sullivan Show, all coordinating the effort for the Beatles' arrival. So, people just love to take credit when, you know, they did not play a big role, but they like to tell you they did. So you have to watch out for that. And then other times, things get told and told so many times they'd accept it as true. One of the trickier ones is Sid Bernstein. Wonderful man. I met Sid several times, truly love the guy, great guy. But Sid Bernstein did not bring the Beatles to America. Brian Epstein brought the Beatles to America. Ed Sullivan had booked the Beatles prior to Sid getting the idea to do anything with the Beatles. But Sid put him in Carnegie Hall, you know, gave him instant credibility. So Sid was extremely important in the Beatles in America, but he wasn't the one that brought them to America. And that doesn't lessen what he did. And by the way, Sid was one of the truly good guys in a really tough business. So,
Wow.
it's a tricky thing because, I'll tell that to people and they'll say, well, but Sid said this. And I said, look, that's not exactly correct, but he was important, and here's why. So, you come across those things. The other weird thing was that when I did The Beatles Are Coming, my thinking was, well, what caused Beatlemania to explode in America? It was three dominoes had to fall. And one of them was Walter Cronkite broadcasting a story on the Beatles on December 10th, domino number one. Domino number two, 15-year-old Marcia Albert of Silver Spring sees the TV show and sends an email. No, wait, we didn't have email then. Writes a letter to the local DJ, as Chuck Berry would sing. And, and Carol James at WWDC gets this letter saying, I saw this group, the Beatles, on the Ed Sullivan Show. Why can't we have music like that in America? Carol James was the perfect person to get that because he was friends with someone who was, as they called them in those days, stewardesses rather than flight attendants with BOAC. And he asked her to bring the latest record, I Want to Hold Your Hand. That record gets played on the air. Marcia Albert introduces it on December 17, and demand for it skyrockets. And Capitol was planning on putting out the record in mid-January. Instead, they rush up the release date to the day after Christmas. Why is that so important? Because kids are not in school the day after Christmas. They're playing video games and computers. No, they didn't have that. They were listening to the radio. And what did they hear? New York WMCA plays it, WINS, WABC jump on it. And in about a week's time, I Want to Hold Your Hand is number one in America, and the rest of the nation follows suit. Why is that important? Because when the Beatles were on the Sullivan Show on February 9 of 64, rather than the normal 20 to 30 million tuning in, 73 million people tune in. Now, I thought I had that story perfect. And then when I was doing the Beatles, Please Please Me to With the Beatles, I realized I missed the first domino. The first domino was up until September 1 of 63, the television networks in America had a 15-minute evening news broadcast. In 15 minutes, you do not have time for feature stories. CBS expanded from 15 minutes to 30 minutes, which meant they could have expanded feature stories. In addition, CBS had a morning news show with Mike Wallace. That show did not have the budget for big feature stories, although they had the time for them. And that's how CBS was able to have two of their reporters do a story on the Beatles in mid-November of 63. So the first domino is CBS expanding the evening news from 15 to 30 minutes. Who knew? Now we know.
Speaking about Nicky Byrne, now I just want to say this because I wanted to ask a question before you brought up Nicky Byrne. But to me, the most fascinating part of the Beatles story, and Ivor, I want your take on this too, because you were there on the first tours. In my mind, and I don't blame Brian Epstein, right, that they gave away 90% of merchandise takings to Celtab, which is Beatles spelt backwards. I don't want to get into the legalities of it, but what I'm saying is that money, 90%, the story is that when he gave a check to Brian, he goes, here's your share. And Brian thought that that was what? 10%. That's all he got, wasn't it? And all the money that the Beatles lost, 90% of their merchandising in America. And at that time, you've got to understand, merchandising was new. So here they come from England, and then they know about their merchandising within their country, which isn't that huge, but the Beatles were huge there.
Someone comes to Brian and they say to him, look, I've got an idea that will help promote your group. We would like to put your group on T-shirts, on school binders, and they're going to be plastered all over the place, and we'll give you 10%. Brian's thinking, man, not only is this free advertising, but I get 10% too. Doesn't sound like a bad deal.
Yeah, but what my question is now, I got no idea what this 90% ended up being in millions and millions and millions of dollars, right? If you got any idea at all, and I mean, that's been going forever, because after this merchandising, then I'm just saying, people that then are making fakes of Beatles merchandising from the 60s. So it's never stopped the merchandising. But it must have been so immense that had the Beatles had control of 100% of the merchandising, they would have made their life money right there just on that tour. Would that be right?
Bruce,
Never would have been
because you are
100%.
90% to 10%. That was the one that Brian took because, as Bruce pointed out, merchandising was nothing.
Yeah.
And I want to tell you that when I was on that tour with John, he hated merchandising. And I tell the story about buying a wig for I don't know, like for 50 cents, putting it on and going to see him in the suite, and he grabbed it off my head and threw it out the window. So they did not know the appreciation of merchandising. Bruce, you know how long the litigation went on when Brian finally saw the light of day. And you as a lawyer, it went on forever, didn't it?
Yeah.
Brian raking back the money.
Yeah, in doing what he could to salvage things. But I mean, litigation can go on forever.
Yeah.
At the next Fest for Beatle fans, Karen Duchek and I are repeating our performance on My Sweet Lord. And the litigation on My Sweet Lord lasted 25 years.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's crazy. That's a whole nother crazy story. So at the Fest for Beatle fans, be sure to catch that presentation on My Sweet Lord. But yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Law does play a part in it because bear in mind, it is called the music business for a reason. It is a business. But the good news is, and Capitol back in 64 said this. They said, look, no matter how good a job we're doing marketing this band, their music really has to be good or it's not going to work. So you can only go so far with marketing a bad product. Eventually, people catch on and it fades out. The reason the Beatles never faded out was because they had a great product that they evolved with over time. You compare the Beatles to a group like the Dave Clark Five. Dave Clark Five had a great sound, but they never evolved, whereas the Beatles did. The Kinks evolved, the Rolling Stones evolved. But if you don't evolve, you're going to be like the Dave Clark Five. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, great music and a great businessman because he got the masters. So I mean, think of how the Beatles would have been if they had owned their own masters.
I just want to say it's been a riveting show. We thank you so much, Bruce, for being on the show. Ivor Davis, Scott, Daniel, Fred, and Nat. I just want to say what a fantastic collection of books you've done there, Bruce, and just tell everyone how they can get your books and get them autographed again and where they get them from.
Well, here's the latest book, and the books are available at my website, Beatle, BEATLE.net, NET. If you order from the website, the book will be signed and dated, and you can request personalization. We also have digital editions and collector's editions of the books that come with posters, bookmarks, and all kind of other fun stuff. So do check out the website. We also have articles and things I've written over the years, and when I get more time, I'll put up more articles. But do check out Beatle.net. And Ivor, we'll turn it over to you about talk about your latest book, not necessarily the murder one.
No, okay, we'll avoid murder tonight. The Beatles and Me on Tour 60th Anniversary Edition is now out on audiobook, and I wish I had done it because I want to tell you, I really went crazy when the reader did it because I mean I think it was done by AI, to be honest with you, because he kept changing halfway through the bloody book. It was Beatles, and it was just horrendous. But fortunately, I was able to go back to them and say, for God's sake, pronounce the Beatles correctly. If I'd done it, but anyway, reading your own books is another 20 weeks or 10 weeks in the studio. So, Bruce, it's always a pleasure to listen to you. I was going to come to New Orleans recently, but I'm not because it gets too hot in New Orleans, doesn't it?
Oh, no. In case y'all think of coming to New Orleans, it's never humid and never hot. Don't worry.
Scott, just do us a Ringo impersonation saying thank you. You've been watching the Plastic EP Live TV show.
Well, thank you very much for watching the live Plastic EP show from Ringo. Peace and love. Don't forget my birthday. It's coming up next week.
See you, everyone. We love you.